are again, edition 1871 of your talking newspaper for the 2nd of February, would you believe? Candlemas, I remember, I think. I'm here, Charlie's here.
Hello there.
And Buddy's here.
Oh.
We had a bit of snow this morning. There wasn't any snow where I live, but there was a bit of snow here.
Yeah.
Right, before I start, I'm going to just mention our committee meeting. I didn't hear the tape last week because I didn't get it until late, so I think Margaret may have mentioned this. We had our committee meeting. This is not an appeal, but by the way, thank you for anybody who has ever donated and still does. But basically, just to say that roughly our account is now down to about 4,000, and our rent is short of that, is less than that for a year. But quite clearly, by the AGM, we have to make some serious decisions. For various reasons. Cold water has just appeared. For various reasons, our listener numbers are going down. General mortality, I suppose, and also the availability of other mediums and other things to listen to, and also, I think sometimes, difficulties with the post. So we've got to make decisions. Certainly the AGM next time in September will be of great importance. I'll say no more than that for the moment, but we did decide to keep everybody informed, and therefore I believe that I have done. Right, I'm going to stop this section now and then start my speech. Here we go then. Chronic unemployment, famine, rising prices, especially bread, and 20 years of warfare. Are we in 2019? No. 1819. 200 years ago. In August, there will be anniversary programmes on an incident in British history which has been referred to as the Peterloo Massacre. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So, let me just set the scene to some extent. 1819 then, the wars with Napoleon were over, having Napoleon suffered his final defeat at Waterloo at the hands of the Duke of Wellington, who was no more interested in democracy than Napoleon was. And it's not simple to suggest this stuff about triumphs of good over evil and all that nonsense. Basically, if you listen to a lot of folk songs of the early 19th century, many of them are more sympathetic to Napoleon than they are to Wellington. However, Napoleon is no angel either. And like many military leaders, whatever he started with, whatever ideas he started with, conquest became his main reason for being. And that conquest was stopped by that battle. Did the ordinary people benefit from the war? Probably not. Do they ever? And were conditions after the war any better? No. So let's look at the county of Lancashire particularly, because that's where this incident takes place. From a political point of view, Liverpool was well placed in Lancashire. We, by then, elected our own MPs in our own town, but only 2,800 men could vote. Their vote was in public. There was no secret ballot. They spoke their vote to the clerk at the hustings, and the vote was then added. You needed a 40-shilling land qualification. That is, you either had to own land of that value, or rent land of that value, or have property of that value. It was an extremely restricted franchise. However, the situation in the rest of the county was even more ridiculous. Manchester had no member of parliament. If anybody in that town, or Oldham, or any of those surrounding towns wanted to vote, they had to go to Lancaster, the county town, where the poll booth was. They had to speak their vote once they'd got all the way up there, and they elected 2 MPs from the county to sit in the House of Commons. That is all that they could do. There was, by this time, a demand for political reform. That means people wanted the situation to change so that they were represented. The Manchester Patriotic Union was an organisation of people whose main concern was that Manchester and its surrounding towns should gain members of Parliament. There were other demands made at this time, things like universal suffrage. That was extremely outrageous in 1819 and still, of course, 100 years away. There were female societies in Lancashire as well, as you will hear, who were making similar demands. These were quite modern demands. Annual parliaments, which we never got, but other things that did come later. The Manchester Patriotic Union then calls a meeting in January where 60,000 men, women and children attend. That is about 6 or 7% of the population of the area. And this meeting is a first meeting to discuss the possibility of changing the representation of the county. There was no difficulty with that. You were allowed, so far anyway, you were allowed to do that. The parliamentary situation was quite disgraceful. Let's look at Old Sarum, which was a brick wall and the corner of a field in Salisbury in Wiltshire, with 1 registered voter and 2 MPs. Let's look at another Dulwich, not the Dulwich London borough, but a town in East Anglia, which by 1819 had disappeared into the sea, almost. Cornwall, with the lowest county population in the country, had 52 MPs. And Manchester, with a population of over 100,000, and 7 other towns with populations over 100,000, had no MPs at all. Individual people owned seats. Rich landowners owned seats and gave them out to whomsoever they wanted and to who would disagree with them. For instance, just after this time, the Duke of Newcastle, who was extreme in his conservative politics, gave the seat of Newark to William Gladstone, who then, as a young man, was an extreme Tory. He later became Liberal Prime Minister. He gave Gladstone the seat of Newark in 1833. In 1832, under this old system, on the vague understanding that whatever Newcastle wanted him to say in Parliament, he would say. He did gain the seat. Many people, Sir James Lowther, for instance, in the north of England, had 20 seats in his ken. He would decide who 20 members of Parliament were. So let's look at wages. The wages of a textile weaver in 1803 were 15 shillings per week. 6 days, 12-hour days, 72 hours. Anyone from the age of 8 could be employed, and in some mills, children of between 6 and 8 were employed. This shilling might be £3 or £4 now. However, by the end of the war, with prices going up, particularly the price of bread, which mattered to so many people, and I haven't got much bread left myself, by the way, I'm sure you don't want to hear that, the price, the wages of a weaver had gone down to 4 or 5 shillings. So you can see what situation that put people in. By 1815, a corn law had been brought in to protect English farmers from cheaper foreign imports. Well, it did, but it was lower quality corn and our people were having to pay for it. This argument over tariffs is still continuing today, of course. This is the situation that people were in those 3 or 4 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. 3 years of the end of the wars, there were the beginnings of protest. One of them were called the Blanketeers, where people decided that they would march from the northern towns and some in the Midlands, meet at Stafford, and then walk to London, only covered by a blanket. Well, of course, the Jarrow marches, 120 years later, were of a similar nature and making similar demands. That demonstration was broken up, although a small number of people were allowed to go into London to present a petition. Now, the legal situation is this, as far as I can work it out. You could advocate parliamentary reform, providing you did not advocate any disorder or attack on the government to do it. So you could call a meeting to discuss the question, basically, providing you didn't do anything actually about it. In January of 1819, a meeting addressed by the radical leader Henry Hunt, who was the main political figure in the north of England at that time. This meeting passed a motion. Oh, by the way, it was held at St Peter's Field in Manchester, where the incident we are going to describe takes place 7 months later. They passed a motion demanding that the Prince Regent, that is George IV, who was still at this time acting as regent for his father George III, who was still alive, just about, for another year, asking him very politely to appoint ministers who would repeal the Corn Law. Now that was the way they had to do it, a kind of gentle invitation, a kind of begging letter to the Prince Regent. In July, the magistrates of the town, these are the kind of justices of the peace, not today drawn from all sections of society and all groups of society. The JPs at that time were all of them selected from what you might call the voting class, the upper class, the landlords and their families. In July, they wrote a letter to the Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, who had been a former Prime Minister and was known to be extreme, saying that they expected a political rising to be imminent in their town and in their county. They blamed the press for making demands, particularly one newspaper, the Manchester Observer, and demagogues, that is speakers, as in Henry Hunt. Anybody who speaks with passion or firmness was called a demagogue in those days. They were complaining that they had no power to stop any meetings that were called in the Manchester area. Now, a meeting was then called for the 2nd of August. Called by the Manchester Patriotic Union, and many of the officials of that organisation were attached to and working for this newspaper, the Manchester Observer. The founder of that newspaper, Joseph Johnson, was secretary of the Patriotic Union, for instance. It was him that invited Henry Hunt to address that meeting on the 2nd of August 1819. And that meeting was called to discuss the question of parliamentary representation or parliamentary reform. Ruin and starvation stare one in the face. This letter was intercepted by government spies, copied, and then sent on to the government. This is the letter inviting Henry Hunt to be the main speaker, by the way. This is the letter that Johnson wrote to Hunt. So the government's reading all of his letters. In fact, at this time, there seems to have been more spies reading people's letters than even now, although I doubt whether that's true. And sometimes you do wonder whether some of these incidents were provoked against the government, were actually provoked by the spies, so that the government could then act against the people concerned. Where have you heard that before? I have to be careful here. So, this letter then is intercepted and sent on. The 15th Hussars Cavalry Regiment is then dispatched to Manchester. The meeting for the 2nd of August was then delayed to the 9th of August, and the main item on the agenda was to get Manchester an MP. William Holton was the leader of the Manchester magistrates, and he wrote for advice. And guess what? Advice was sought from the Attorney General. Oh, we've heard that recently as well, haven't we? The Attorney General said, quite fairly I think, that the meeting could take place, providing the meeting only advocated a change in parliamentary representation. Providing they didn't do anything about it or act against the government or any of its officials, they probably were entitled to have their meeting. The magistrates did not agree with that. He also thought, though, that if the magistrates wanted to, they could declare the meeting illegal on various other methods, one of them being, say, the carrying of banners as an example. The meeting was announced on the 31st of July. The acting Home Secretary, Sidmouth was here again, the acting Home Secretary, Henry Hobhouse, who was more generally sympathetic than most members of his government at that time, he was the one who sought the Attorney General's advice and was more sympathetic that at least the meeting could take place, but that if the people at the meeting tried to choose an MP, that in itself would be illegal. They knew from their spies, this is how it gets complicated, everyone, they knew from intercepted letters, that is the government, that Henry Hunt was going to advise, as he usually did, a peaceful demonstration, no disorder, and a quiet and determined request that Parliament be altered for the public good. And nobody could argue with that. So bizarrely enough then, they think the meeting should continue because they think it's all right, because they think they know what the guy's going to say. The magistrates don't know what the guy's going to say, so they're more worried about it. And it just shows you. You may have all this technology now, but we've always had this spying and have always had the state checking on everything that people did. So, what the government told the magistrates to do was to watch the meeting, collect all the evidence, and if needs be, later on, they could use that evidence for prosecutions. Now, on the last couple of demonstrations I was on, I won't mention what they were for because I don't want to involve the LTN in that, but just as a matter of interest, we were all photographed before we moved off. That is, nothing had been said, there was no disorder, but we were photographed just as a matter of course. And when I asked one of the officers why they were doing that, he very politely said to me, "You've got nothing to worry about, we just need the information for later. If you're doing no harm or breaking no laws, you've got nothing to worry about." But they still had all the photographs in case they needed them. Well, everybody will have a view on that either way. But in 1819, that's what they said. Watch the meeting, see what everybody says, and if we have to act later, we will. If the meeting gets out of hand, he said, the Home Secretary said, you've got troops there if you need them. So, he was acting on information that he now had. A new date, the 16th of August, was then chosen. The order from the Manchester Patriotic Committee was that all of the people who attended should be neat and tidy and sober and quiet, and there should be women and children present because that would militate to keep everybody in order. The reason for this is that normally the press, which was mostly supporting the government, would usually criticise workers for being ragged and dirty, and how can you take notice of what they're saying if they're in such a ragged and dirty state? No, they were the rules to the meeting. You had to stay in your own town, gather in your groups, and then all at a given time march to the central point for the
Samuel
start of the meeting.
Bamford was the leader of the Middleton delegation.
He is very important. He is a weaver, but also a poet, a writer, a very educated working man, in a time when that was difficult, and has left us very valuable and very fair-minded reports on what happens on that day. As I say, he leads the Middleton contingent. The Wikipedia article which I looked at yesterday morning, amazingly enough, gives us a list of all the contingents from all the towns that they came from, which I have not seen before. The magistrates receive a letter saying that working men in Rochdale have been seen to drill. Now, they always had this fear, the magistrates, that ordinary people would organise themselves in a military way, with officers, marches and procedures, and uniforms even. But they weren't drilling in Rochdale for that. They were drilling to get used to this idea of the march on the central location so that the meeting would start on time and so on, so that everybody would appear in good order. 7 a.m. on the day of the meeting, the Deputy Surveyor of Manchester arrived on the field where the demo, St Peter's Field, where it was going to take place, to remove all stones that might have been thrown. In fact, he is reported to have removed 1/4 ton of items which could have been thrown. These weren't left there by anybody, it was just an open field. It was almost wasteland, although there was a lot of it. Anyway, by 7 o'clock, he came and he moved out all the stuff. It was a Monday, it was a hot summer's day, everybody was out and about, and a crowd of 60,000 was expected. Nobody agrees on the number of people who attended this meeting. I've seen estimates from 60,000 to 100,000, so I'll say 60,000 to be safe. Now, the magistrates had a meeting at 9 o'clock, a breakfast at the Star Inn on Deansgate. I don't know whether it's still there. A breakfast at the Star Inn on Deansgate to discuss what they would do. They came to no particular decision, but at 10:30 they moved to occupy a house at the corner of the field so they could watch the meeting, or to observe the meeting. They had the 15th Hussars, as I have said, 600 men. They had an artillery unit with 2 6-pound guns.
Good grief.
They had 400 special constables. They had the Manchester Yeomanry, 120 cavalrymen who were volunteers, mostly from the business community in the area. Weekend soldiers, you might have called them later on. They come in for a height of abuse later on, obviously, as you will hear. They also had many other volunteers. They also had the 88th Regiment of Foot. You will hear about them later as well. The forces of law and order, you might say, were in attendance. Many of the yeomanry were publicans. Many of the newspapers said that many of them were drunk. Now, I'm going to be careful with this one. Obviously, everybody took sides on this later on. But I suppose it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They'd all been together since early morning. The magistrates had been in the Star and Garter, so I presume the yeomanry had been somewhere similar. It is possible that some of them had taken drink. They certainly behaved later as if they had taken drink. One obviously biased writer does refer to them, the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, as the Young Conservative Party in arms. That is a reference from a writer of the time. Another writer, who obviously shows his own colours, said it was the Manchester business mafia on horseback. Not a bad description, but anyway. The commander of the army in the north of England at this time was famous Waterloo veteran Sir John Byng. He commanded the Army North region. He told the magistrates to act with vigour and that they had the authority to do it. But he said they also had his troops there if they needed them. That would have been all right for the 9th of August, but on the 16th of August, he went to York races, because he always went to York races on the 16th of August with most of his senior officers. He left his second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Guy Lestrange, in charge, whom he said he had full confidence in. Or I have absolute confidence in him, he said. It was a happy, excited crowd, a fairground atmosphere, lots of women. In fact, an unusually large number of women, according to many of the reports, and lots of children, lots of little ones as well. So, many of them had banners, calling, as I say, for things that only happened, many of them, 100 years later. There's a very good description of one of the ladies from the Female Reform Society who arrives in her carriage with a banner. Mary Fielder, I think her name is, one of the first political women activists I've come across at that time. Anyway, at noon, 12 o'clock now, constables on the field are protecting the building that the magistrates are in. They are in two lines. They form a barrier between the house where the magistrates are to where the hustings are. It's like a platform for the speakers. Henry Hunt arrives at 1 p.m. He has with him John Knight, a reforming manufacturer. That's a manufacturer who was on the side of the meeting. Joseph Johnson, the owner of the newspaper, The Observer. Several more of the Observer staff. Richard Carlyle, who published the newspaper, and many others, many businessmen, but who had chosen the side of parliamentary reform. There were also reporters there, including John Smith from the Liverpool Mercury, which was a very influential and very substantial newspaper at that time. So this is reported by the press, this meeting, and what happens at it. The crowd on the field now was packed. There was probably too many. And probably people were squashed. And there may not have been as many stewards as there would be at a meeting today. There was a very enthusiastic reception for Henry Hunt. Now, that's when the magistrates said that just by that enthusiastic reception, they were making a flagrant gesture of disorder. The Holton, the leader of the magistrate, then issues arrest warrants for Hunt, Johnson and others. He then writes letters to Major Thomas Trafford, commanding the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, and says to him, I've put arrest warrants in, but we'll need military help to deliver these arrest warrants. He tells the Chief Constable, John Andrews, this, and Andrews says he can't go near the hustings to arrest the men without military support. At this time, he is holding the warrant. Yeah, he's holding the warrant at this time. A letter is also sent to Guy Lestrange, the military commander, requesting help in the making of the arrests. The magistrate says, I am making this request because I have deemed it that the civil power, that is the police, is wholly inadequate for what I have asked them to do. The Manchester Yeomanry were the first to receive the note because they were nearby. They immediately charged into the crowd. One trooper, in such haste to catch up with his mates, knocked a woman down in Cooper Street, which was not the field itself, but one of the adjoining streets, knocked a young child out of her arms, and this poor little one, aged 2, becomes the first fatality of the day. The charge was unsatisfactory and disorderly. The yeomanry were then split into groups and were slashing left and right with their sabres at the crowd which surrounded them, which could not really escape. The 88th Foot Regiment were used to block some of the escape routes. Some of the officers of the 15th Hussars who were very uncomfortable with this. The army was always careful about this. Obviously all right to take on the king's or queen's enemies abroad, but often reluctant to be involved in these domestic situations. After all, where did they recruit most of their ordinary soldiers from? So the 15th Hussars commander then says, well, at least give them escape routes, but these routes were still blocked. Andrews, the chief constable, then asks Captain Hugley of the Manchester Yeomanry to go to the hustings with him, where Hunt and several others are arrested before really they have started to speak. A complete panic breaks out then, with the military racing about the field, attacking people. Many people were either bludgeoned by sabres or were trampled by the crowd or by the horses as they tried to escape. In fact, although nobody actually says this, to me it's a miracle that the casualties were, I say only, the casualties were only 15 fatalities and 500 or 600 wounded. We don't know how many were wounded. Many people were frightened to report their wounds. There were no GPs as you'd know them anyway, and many people were frightened to report their wounds in case their employers found out and they lost their jobs. Captain Hughley, who was one of the cavalry leaders in the yeomanry, owned a factory, and he immediately sacked anybody who he found had attended the meeting. The main decision by the military was to attack anybody carrying a banner and to bring any banner down. The banners were deemed to be illegal, whatever they said on them. Tempers were lost on the side of the military, and they charged from different portions of the field. Within 10 minutes, though, the field was generally cleared, apart from those people who were killed or those people who were too ill or too injured to move. Incidentally, I should tell you that Hunt and his colleagues were tried the next year and given sentences of between 1 and 2 years. The sentences were light at that time, but for various other reasons, probably because of the distaste of many people for what had actually happened. There were hundreds of injured people left on the field, and a Manchester Relief Committee was formed to help all those people who had been injured. Now, Charlie's just asked me why it was called Peterloo. Well, it's going to become obvious in a minute. Obviously, it's the combination of Waterloo and St Peter's Field, but there's a very interesting reference to this later. Now, at that time, you couldn't say much about the government or you'd be in big trouble. But there was things called cartoons which became massively important. People sometimes think of these as being modern, but sometimes people could be more devastating. What's that phrase about picture? What's that?
Pictures is worth 1,000
words. Yeah, that's it, Joe, yeah. And sometimes these pictures mattered. So one picture that James Cruikshank published, just showing a general scene of people being sabred and tagged. And underneath he says, remember, the more you kill, the less rates you'll have to pay. So, I mean, that is pretty brutal. So, these cartoons were published very carefully within a few days of this incident, which of course was widely reported by the Times newspaper, very sympathetic to the government, by the Liverpool Mercury, very sympathetic to the government, by the Leeds Mercury, very unsympathetic to the government. And really, these reports were factual, but of course, whatever the editorial policy of the newspaper was, they would also put their slant on it. Now, there were 168 women casualties. I've only concentrated on the women casualties because I was so fascinated to think that there were so many women actually politically involved in the meeting. The inquests all declared accidental death, and no blame was put on any of the military. Indeed, somebody very bravely tried to take action against the Manchester Yeomanry, and the case was heard in 1822 when the men were fully exonerated and congratulated for their brave actions on the day. So it was a brave thing to actually do. The cause of death was usually trampled or sabred. Margaret Bell, one of the women involved, beaten to death. Mary Hayes, another of a woman, a mother of 6 and pregnant at the time, died later of wounds. Sarah Jones of Salford, mother of 6, was also sabred, attacked by the cavalry. One man who was there, veteran, a man called John Lees, who had fought at Waterloo and who was killed at Peterloo, although he did not die until the December. It was very significant. His comment was, as recorded by the Manchester newspapers, at Waterloo it was man to man, but at Peterloo it was downright murder. I was at both, I know. He died the next day. Thousands of medals were given out and distributed, supporting and sympathising with those people who had been killed and injured in the incident. Pamphlets were published demanding inquiries and reparations and compensation, although that was never given. Now, there might have been sympathy, and thousands of people bought pamphlets to support the Manchester Relief Committee, but the government used this incident to crack down on all political demonstration and representation. All reform newspapers were closed, including the Manchester Observer. They were raided and all of their equipment was stolen. All meetings of more than 3 people were banned. Something called the 6 Acts was brought in to oppose any founding of any trade or craft union, or for any meeting, or for any letter between 2 people which advocated any change in the parliamentary system. This is a brutal reaction by the government, headed at that time by, would you believe, Lord Liverpool, Robert Banks Jenkinson, who has no connection with Liverpool at all. It was just a title.
Except to besmirch our name.
Yeah, to besmirch our name, quite right. He was Prime Minister for 15 years and had the unique ability of stopping other members of his cabinet from killing each other. That's one of his claims to fame. I've told you about the action against the soldier, which was dismissed in 1822, yes. Thanks of the Prince Regent were conveyed by Lord Sidmouth on the 7th of August to the Manchester magistrates. There were other riots in local towns after the St. Petersfield massacre, and there were other incidents as well. One which I'll just mention briefly, the Cato Street plot, where a group of men under the leadership of Arthur Thistlewood, I haven't read my notes on this, so I'll just make a brief comment on it, agreed that they would attack a dinner where the cabinet was meeting at Lord Sidmouth's house, disarm, kill or arrest the cabinet and attempt to take over the government. But unfortunately, before they'd got as far as the room, one of the spies who the government had employed betrayed the plot, and they were all arrested and indeed all later executed. But there was a time of great disorder at this time and a serious attack on civil liberties. It has been the case, I think, that when governments have felt threatened, they have often acted in this way. Sometimes, of course, for the good of the people, when terrorist attacks are feared, as we've had in recent years. But there's always that narrow and interesting line about what all governments do to protect us and how far it protects us or how far it protects them from criticism. One of the things that happened because of Peterloo was a businessman called John Edward Taylor, who had witnessed the meeting that day, who had not himself been particularly sympathetic to the demands, but because of what happened after, formed a newspaper called the Manchester Guardian, which still exists under the name of the Guardian, of course, and became a very influential newspaper in the 19th and indeed into modern times. Under the Reform Bill of 1832, which made some changes. For instance, some of the rotten boroughs, but not all of them, were ended. That's the places where they only had one voter, for instance. Manchester finally got a decision to have its own 2 MPs. Certain changes were made. But that bill was greeted with massive opposition from the governing class and only passed at the very last minute, when many of the governing class, including the Duke of Wellington, were so feared of revolution that they allowed the bill to pass through the House of Lords. But I suppose that is another story. But certainly, at least by 1832, parliamentary representation had been slightly improved. So there it is, Waterloo, Peterloo, one of the most important incidents on the road to political progress. And it is probably true that although obviously non-violent protests are the best, it has often been unfortunately proven that progress has not always been made by just persuasion and a good argument. And sometimes, as in Peterloo, people had to march. Well, thank you very much, everyone. There you go. See you next time.
Ta-ra, everyone.
To LTN number 1871. Your technician tonight is Mike. Lighting up time is 4:43 p.m. to 8 a.m. And if you want to know what's going on in the city, music, theatre, comedy and events, go to the website liverpoolecho.co.uk/what's on. And here you'll find all the information you need, times, dates, prices and any telephone numbers you need for enquiries. I've put a few travel things down. Northern Line on the Saturday the 2nd of February and up to Sunday the 10th of February, there'll be rail replacement buses between Southport and Hall Road, Monday to Friday, 0628 to 1943, for those of you who are working, unlike me. And trains will run from Hunts Cross to Formby, where passengers will pick up replacement buses to Southport. There are several more noted disruptions with trains not stopping at various stations, and further details can be found on merseyrail.org/platform upgrade works. Replacement buses on the Wirral line, 3rd of February, Sunday, and information on the same merseyrail.org site. Information for travel service phone line is 0151 330 1000, 0151 330 1000, and that's your information for travel services. That's open 24 hours, I think, 8 till 8. And your readers tonight are Nikki, Phil and me,
An article
Barbara.
from the Echo of the 30th of January headed TV's Dr. Leah, I'll treat/blues fan for free, and it's an article by Lottie Gibbons. A former Apprentice TV show winner has offered free cosmetic treatment to an Everton fan who had his face slashed ahead of the Blues FA Cup tie with Millwall. Jay Burns never made it to Millwall's ground, the Den, after being caught up in a pre-match clash in Hawkston Road, Southwark, on Saturday. Mr Burns, 29, told the Echo the group of Everton fans he was travelling with were not looking for trouble and were being escorted by police when they were attacked by another group. He was rushed to hospital where he required more than 25 stitches to a wound stretching from beside his right eye down to his chin. Following the brawl, Mr Burns posted a graphic image of his injuries on Facebook and wrote, "Absolutely devastated about my face. Thanks to all the Everton lads and everyone who has messaged me, including the lads." Seeing his photos, Dr. Leah Totten, who won the 2013 series The Apprentice and runs a cosmetic skin clinic, offered a kind gesture to the fan. She wrote on Twitter, "Gosh, this poor man, how awful to do that to someone's face. If anyone knows this chap, please tell him to get in touch with Dr. Leah Clinics once his stitches are out. We would like to offer him treatment for the scar to minimise it as much as possible, free of charge." Police are confident that they will soon know the identities of those involved in the mass brawl and arrest them. Deputy Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist of the Metropolitan Police said, "We have a highly skilled team closely reviewing this evidence. We will use this evidence and all tools within our power to locate the individuals involved in this ridiculous behaviour, whether they come from London, Liverpool or elsewhere. We will bring them to justice. Once identified, we will also proactively explore ways of restricting those intent on engaging in violence and disorder from attending these events in future."